What if the future of the British monarchy was rewritten overnight? What if the story that has captivated millions for decades, the saga of princes and princesses, of tradition and duty, suddenly had a twist so shocking that it would make even the most loyal royal watchers drop their tea in disbelief? This isn't just gossip, and it's not just tabloids spinning wild tales. This is a story that cuts straight to the heart of power, loyalty, and betrayal. A story about a king, his children, and a secret that could shake the very foundations of the monarchy. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It began quietly, in the shadowed halls of Buckingham Palace. The world only sees the glittering facade, red carpets, ceremonial robes, and waves to cheering crowds. But behind those golden doors, tension simmers. Secrets, arguments, and private conversations shape decisions that ripple across nations. And in this story, the tension wasn't just simmering, it was boiling over. King Charles, a man steeped in centuries of tradition and expectations, suddenly faced a revelation that he could not ignore. A revelation that would force him to act, not just as a father, but as a sovereign, protector of the crown, and guardian of the monarchy's legacy. And at the center of this storm were two figures who have captivated the world in recent years: Prince Harry, the rebellious son of the heir, and Meghan Markle, the American outsider who became a duchess overnight. Their story has been told and retold in documentaries, interviews, and viral headlines. But what the public has not yet seen or understood is the private storm brewing inside the palace. It all comes down to a child, Archie. Innocent, charming, the focus of media adoration and tabloid fascination alike. But behind the smiles and photo ops, a secret lingered. A secret that would ignite a chain reaction of consequences, culminating in a decision that would alter the lives of an entire family. And make no mistake, this isn't just a family drama. In the royal world, personal revelations have political weight, financial implications, and a ripple effect that can extend across countries. Imagine, for a moment, being King Charles. You are not just a father, but the monarch responsible for centuries of history, tradition, and expectations. Every action you take is scrutinized. Every word you speak can shape public perception, and every decision carries consequences far beyond your private life. And then, something happens, a discovery that shakes you to your core. A truth about your own grandson that no one saw coming. How would you respond? What choices would you make if protecting the monarchy meant confronting your own children in ways that could shatter familial bonds? The revelation came in an unlikely form. A private letter, a whispered conversation, a leak to a trusted aide. Whatever the medium, the information hit King Charles like a thunderclap. The details were shocking. And while the palace is no stranger to scandal or controversy, this revelation was different. It was personal. It was political. It was explosive. And the king knew, almost instantly, that action was necessary. But what does action mean in the royal context? It isn't as simple as a stern talk over tea or a public rebuke in front of cameras. In the monarchy, action is codified, ceremonial, and deliberate. Titles can be revoked, privileges rescinded, and access to the institution denied. And yet, these actions are rarely taken lightly, especially when the individuals involved are your own children. The stakes could not be higher, and the decision would not only affect Harry and Meghan, but also the wider perception of the monarchy in a world that increasingly scrutinizes its every move. Now, pause for a moment and consider the human element. Behind the royal pomp and ceremony are real emotions: love, anger, disappointment, pride, and betrayal. Imagine the private conversations that took place in the palace corridors, the hushed tones in drawing rooms, the letters passed in secrecy, the phone calls at odd hours of the night. Emotions run high when family, duty, and legacy collide. And in this story, they collided with catastrophic intensity. The public has seen glimpses of tension: Harry's public criticisms, Meghan's tell-all interviews, the media storm around every appearance. But the palace, and especially King Charles, operates in a different realm. There is a system, a protocol, and a chain of command that governs every reaction. And when the king decided that something had to be done, it wasn't just a personal decision. It was a statement, a signal to the world that no one, not even his own son and daughter-in-law, is above the responsibilities and expectations of the crown. And what was at the heart of this decision? Archie, a child whose existence was meant to bring joy and continuity, suddenly became the fulcrum of tension and scrutiny. Rumors swirled in whispers, questions floated in secret corridors, and the weight of tradition bore down on the youngest member of the family. The revelation about Archie was more than a personal shock. It was a potential threat to the very narrative of the monarchy. And when King Charles confronted this truth, he realized that the only way to protect the institution, and perhaps himself, was to take decisive, unprecedented action. But the question remains, how far would a king go to protect the monarchy? And what lines would he cross in the name of duty? These are not rhetorical questions. In the royal context, every decision carries consequences that ripple through generations. Removing titles, rescinding privileges, and altering the public perception of a child and his parents is not merely administrative. It is transformative. It changes history, reshapes legacies, and challenges the delicate balance between personal love and institutional responsibility. And so, the stage was set. The players were in place. King Charles, Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, and the young Archie, all caught in a web of secrets, expectations, and revelations that could not be ignored. The public would soon learn only fragments, carefully curated by the palace and the media. But the truth, the private reality, was far more dramatic than any headline could convey. It was a story of betrayal, revelation, power, and the ultimate test of familial bonds. What makes this story even more compelling is the timing. In recent years, the monarchy has faced scrutiny like never before. Social media amplifies every misstep, documentaries reveal every nuance, and public opinion shifts with the speed of a tweet. In this climate, a revelation about Archie could not be contained. It had to be addressed, and addressed decisively. King Charles knew that the choices he made in the coming days would be dissected, debated, and remembered for years to come. And yet, for all the power, for all the protocol, for all the centuries of tradition, King Charles faced a profoundly human dilemma. He had to reconcile his role as a father with his role as king. He had to balance loyalty to his family with loyalty to the crown. He had to act in a way that protected the monarchy, even if it meant causing pain to those closest to him. And in that tension, in that clash of duty and emotion, the stage was set for a drama unlike anything the royal family had faced in generations. But just when it seemed the story had reached its peak tension, a twist awaited, something that no one could have predicted. Something that would force every character to confront their deepest fears and question every assumption. The revelation about Archie was only the beginning. The consequences, the fallout, and the decisions yet to come would shock the world and redefine the narrative of one of the most famous families in history. And so we begin this story not with speculation, not with rumors, but with the truth as it unfolded behind closed doors. We follow King Charles as he grapples with revelation, duty, and the impossible choices that define leadership. We witness Harry and Meghan as they navigate the storm of secrecy, media scrutiny, and familial expectation. And we see how a child, born into privilege, suddenly becomes the center of a story that transcends generations, politics, and public fascination. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if everything you thought you knew about palace life, the traditions, the pomp, the perfection, was only a fraction of the truth? Behind the grand facades, the royal family is human. They laugh, they fight, they fear, they betray. But rarely do the world's eyes see what happens when the quiet tension of generations finally snaps. In the early days of that fateful revelation, Buckingham Palace hummed with its usual air of protocol. Staff moved with precision, security kept their posts, and the public remained blissfully unaware of the brewing storm. But inside the walls, the atmosphere was anything but ordinary. Whispers echoed through the gilded hallways. Conversations stopped when doors opened. Eyes darted from one side to the other, as if everyone knew something monumental was about to happen, but no one dared speak it aloud. King Charles, ever composed in public, was a storm behind closed doors. He moved from room to room, consulting advisors, lawyers, and longtime aides, weighing every word, every implication. How does a king respond when the private world collides with the public spectacle? when the very institution he is sworn to protect is threatened not by a foreign enemy, but by his own blood. And then there were Harry and Meghan. For years, they had carved a narrative of independence, of freedom from royal constraints. Interviews, memoirs, and explosive public statements had positioned them as outsiders, often critics, of the very monarchy they were born into or married into. But the palace had always maintained a silent patience. Tides of discontent were tolerated behind the golden walls. Until now. Imagine walking through the corridors knowing a secret that could unravel decades of tradition. That was Harry's reality. That was Meghan's reality. And that was Archie's, though he could not possibly understand the weight resting on his small shoulders. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered conversation carried the weight of anticipation. Who would speak first? Who would reveal the truth? Who would decide the next move? Even in the quiet, tension crackled. There were subtle signs that all was not as it seemed. Staff who once moved with serene composure now flinched at the sound of a door opening. Security teams altered routines slightly, almost imperceptibly, but perceptibly enough to those paying attention. There were meetings in rooms where windows were shuttered and blinds drawn tight. Conversations interrupted by urgent phone calls. Something was coming, and everyone sensed it. The quiet before the storm is an eerie place. It's a tension you can almost taste. Every footstep seems louder, every sigh more pronounced. For those within the palace walls, it was a tension that suffused every aspect of life. Routine engagements, afternoon teas, charity visits, ceremonial walks through royal gardens, felt like performances in a theater where the stakes were suddenly unimaginably high. Harry's interactions with his aides were more curt. Meghan's correspondence carried undertones of urgency. Even minor slip-ups, misfiled documents, delayed letters, felt catastrophic in the new, charged atmosphere. But how did the palace get to this point? To understand, you must trace the threads of tension that had been building for years. Harry had long struggled with the expectations of his birthright. Though adored by the public for his charm and candor, he often clashed with the weight of tradition. He was outspoken, rebellious, and at times reckless, a combination that infuriated older, more conservative members of the family. Meghan, too, was a disruptor, challenging norms that had persisted for centuries. Her presence was both a cultural phenomenon and a lightning rod for controversy. Together, they were a pair capable of extraordinary influence and, simultaneously, extraordinary disruption. Every family has moments of strain, but in the royal family, strain is magnified 1,000-fold. Every argument carries public significance. Every decision reflects centuries of precedent, and every whisper could ripple across the globe. When the palace sensed that Harry and Meghan were on a trajectory that threatened not just their own reputations but the reputation of the monarchy itself, alarms rang quietly behind the curtains, behind the ceremonial doors, and behind the golden walls. Yet, for all the tension, there was also a fragile calm. In the moments between meetings, between consultations, between clandestine conversations, the palace seemed almost ordinary. Gardens bloomed. Portraits of ancestors watched silently from walls. The echo of footsteps across marble floors reminded those within that history had been made here countless times before. And yet, this time, history itself was being challenged, not by foreign powers, not by parliamentary debate, but by a family secret that could not be ignored. The quiet wasn't just a backdrop, it was a weapon. Every second of silence heightened anticipation, every pause amplified the unknown. Those working behind the scenes were acutely aware that one misstep could make a delicate situation explode. And for Harry and Meghan, every day spent in the palace, or thinking about the palace from abroad, was a negotiation of fear and desire. Fear of what could happen if secrets emerged. Desire for independence, autonomy, and a life beyond scrutiny. But the quiet before the storm is also where cracks begin to show. Small disagreements, overlooked tensions, subtle looks exchanged across rooms. All of them revealed fractures. Harry noticed the coldness in interactions that once were warm. Meghan sensed the veiled judgments in conversations that once were casual. King Charles felt the weight of legacy pressing heavier than ever. Each subtle signal, each muted reaction, was a warning that the coming storm was inevitable. And then came the first unmistakable signs that the storm was no longer just a metaphor. Letters were redirected. Meetings were scheduled with unusual urgency. Advisors were summoned at odd hours, often returning with expressions that betrayed concern, confusion, and, occasionally, fear. The palace staff, seasoned in centuries of royal protocol, whispered among themselves in ways they had never done before. Something had changed, and no one could quite predict how far it would go. Harry and Meghan, despite their efforts to live partially removed from royal scrutiny, could not escape the gravitational pull of the palace. Invitations arrived. Correspondence piled up. Calls were made with a tone of subtle warning. The tension built not in loud confrontations, but in small, persistent ways. The quiet, it turned out, was not a lull, it was a prelude. And then came the moment that truly shattered the illusion of calm. A private communication, something that should have remained confidential, found its way into the wrong hands. Its contents hinted at truths that were not merely controversial, but explosive. The message spoke of decisions, consequences, and implications that could change the line of succession, the perception of the family, and the very legitimacy of a child. It was subtle at first. A line in a letter, a phrase in a memo, but the weight of that line was undeniable. It signaled that the storm was no longer coming. It had arrived. But what made this storm different from the many other scandals that had brushed past the monarchy? It wasn't about protocol being broken. It wasn't about public image being tarnished. It was about family, about trust, about a bond that, once strained, could fracture irreparably. And at the center of it all was Archie, the young boy whose existence had once been celebrated as a continuation of royal legacy, now cast as a symbol of everything at stake. And as the palace braced for what was coming, each member of the family was faced with a stark reality. History does not wait. It does not negotiate. And when a secret becomes public, when a revelation is unavoidable, the only thing left is action. The calm, the quiet, the pretense of normalcy, all of it would vanish. And when it did, it would leave behind a trail of consequences that no one could control. So here we are, in the quiet before the storm, watching the players move across the stage. Every glance, every whispered conversation, every minor misstep carries the weight of potential disaster. The palace itself seems to hold its breath, aware that tradition, loyalty, and love are all about to collide in ways that could rewrite the story of the monarchy. And at the center of it all, the question lingers. What would happen when the quiet finally breaks? When the storm comes crashing through gilded doors and manicured gardens, will the family survive? Or will the very institution of the monarchy itself be forever changed? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What would you do if a single piece of paper could change the fate of an entire monarchy? That is exactly what happened in the quiet halls of Buckingham Palace, where tradition meets secrecy, and where every word carries consequences that ripple across centuries. The letter arrived unexpectedly, its envelope unremarkable, its contents monumental. The first indication that something was wrong came not from the king himself, but from his private secretary. Normally composed and unflappable, the secretary's face betrayed a tension that was impossible to hide. A letter had arrived with instructions that it be read only by the king. No aides, no intermediaries, no one else. That alone was unusual. In a palace where messages are meticulously logged, copied, and filed, the directive for absolute confidentiality signaled gravity. King Charles broke the seal. The paper felt ordinary to the touch, but the words it carried were anything but. They were precise, calculated, and yet deeply personal. Something about them unsettled even the most seasoned monarch. A revelation was tucked into the formal language, a line that implied consequences far beyond the ordinary. Every sentence demanded reflection. Every phrase carried weight. It was about Archie, the young boy whose presence had long been celebrated and whose existence had been a source of hope and continuity for the monarchy. But the letter suggested that the child was not merely a young royal. He was, in a sense, a complication. A truth had emerged that questioned the very foundation of what the monarchy expected, what the family expected, and what the public assumed. King Charles read the letter 3 times. Each time, the implications became more glaring, more undeniable. The words hinted at a secret about Archie that, if true, could not only alter his standing but challenge the perception of the family in the eyes of the public and, more critically, the palace itself. This was not a matter of etiquette or protocol. This was a revelation with the potential to rewrite the rules that had governed royal succession and privilege for generations. The king's advisors were summoned immediately. The usual air of calm discussion was replaced with urgency, with tension that made the gilded rooms feel smaller, heavier. They debated in hushed tones, aware that every word might carry consequences if overheard. The letter, carefully preserved and circulated only among the most trusted, became the centerpiece of a discussion that would shape the immediate future of the monarchy. Harry and Meghan were unaware of the letter at first, as intended. They were living their lives, navigating public appearances and private challenges, unaware that the palace had just received a document that would alter their status, their privileges, and potentially their very identities within the royal structure. For a family that had long struggled with public perception, the letter represented a convergence of private reality and public expectation, a storm that was building quietly, waiting for the moment to erupt. The letter's content was unsettling not only because of what it revealed, but because of the way it highlighted the fragility of trust. It wasn't an accusation written with malice. It was a presentation of facts, carefully structured, leaving no room for misinterpretation. And yet, the emotional impact could not be overstated. The words cut deeper than any spoken reprimand could. They highlighted failures, revealed secrets, and left King Charles with a decision that was as inevitable as it was painful. Imagine being in the king's shoes. On one side, the love for your children and grandchildren, the bond that has been nurtured for years. On the other side, duty, legacy, and the centuries of history that weigh on your shoulders. Every choice carries consequences. Every delay invites speculation. And every action is scrutinized not just by the family, but by the nation, by the world. The advisors presented their counsel carefully. Some urged discretion, suggesting that the matter be resolved quietly, with minimal disruption. Others argued that a decisive response was necessary, that the monarchy could not tolerate ambiguity or compromise when a potential challenge to legitimacy had been revealed. The debate, though conducted behind closed doors, carried the weight of history itself. And as discussions unfolded, the tension in the palace escalated. Even the most seasoned staff could feel the shift. The quiet before the storm had grown louder, more insistent. But what exactly was in the letter? While the precise details were closely guarded, the implications were clear. Archie's status had become a focal point for questions about legitimacy, privilege, and lineage. And in a monarchy that prizes continuity above all else, such a revelation could not be ignored. For King Charles, it was a call to action, a signal that the time for measured patience had passed, and that immediate decisions were required to safeguard the integrity of the institution. This moment marked a turning point in the relationship between the royal family and Harry and Meghan. What had previously been simmering tensions, disagreements over public statements, perceived slights, and lifestyle choices, now became urgent matters of duty and consequence. The letter was not merely information. It was a catalyst, transforming long-standing issues into a crisis demanding action. The king's response was measured but firm. Consultations with legal advisors, palace officials, and long-standing confidants occurred over the course of hours. Every potential scenario was considered, every precedent reviewed. Historical cases of contested titles, revoked privileges, and disputed lineage were examined meticulously. The weight of precedent was balanced against the immediacy of the current revelation. It became clear that any decision would have far-reaching consequences, not only for Harry and Meghan, but for the monarchy as a whole. Meanwhile, the palace began to subtly prepare for the impact. Communications teams drafted statements, security protocols were reviewed, and contingency plans were quietly discussed. The public would not yet know, but the institution was bracing for a seismic shift. Behind the scenes, the tension was palpable. Every movement, every conversation, every decision was underscored by the knowledge that the eyes of the world, though unaware, were effectively omnipresent. Harry and Meghan remained oblivious, at least initially, as they continued their engagements. They spoke to audiences, attended charitable events, and maintained appearances of normalcy. Yet, behind the curtain, the machinery of royal response was moving in ways they could not perceive. The letter had set into motion a series of events that would test loyalties, challenge assumptions, and force actions that could not be undone. And then came the first hint that the quiet period was over. An aide, trusted and experienced, returned from a meeting with the king with a pale expression. Something had been decided, or at least tentatively outlined, that would soon affect the family in ways previously unimaginable. The tension was no longer theoretical, it was imminent. Every member of the palace staff, every advisor, felt it. The calm had vanished, replaced by the unmistakable energy of impending revelation. Consider the stakes. The revocation of titles and privileges is not merely a symbolic gesture. It affects income, status, public perception, and influence. It signals to the public and to the wider world that even those closest to the crown are accountable to its rules. And in this case, the action would strike at the heart of the family itself, challenging bonds of love, trust, and loyalty. King Charles faced a choice: act swiftly, assertively, and decisively, or delay, hoping the situation would resolve itself. But the letter left no room for hesitation. It presented facts that could not be ignored, facts that demanded a response. In the delicate ecosystem of the monarchy, delay was as dangerous as inaction. And so, with the weight of centuries behind him and the weight of his family in front of him, the king began to chart a course that would have consequences for generations. The implications for Harry and Meghan were staggering. They had always considered themselves somewhat independent, somewhat insulated from the protocols of the institution they married into or were born into. But the palace had spoken, in the form of this letter, and its message was unequivocal. The family, the monarchy, and tradition would not bend. The status quo could not be maintained. Change was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. And as the day progressed, whispers began to circulate. Trusted aides, with varying levels of understanding, sensed the shift. Even within the palace, rumors began to circulate, each slightly more alarming than the last. The calm of the morning had dissipated. The letter, once a quiet note on a desk, had become a catalyst for upheaval. Every step, every decision, every glance carried a new urgency. So now the question looms: how would Harry and Meghan respond when they learned that the seemingly ordinary letter held extraordinary implications? How would they react to the reality that Archie's status, and by extension, their own, was now under scrutiny and threat? And most importantly, how would King Charles navigate the balance between fatherhood and kingship, between love and duty, in the face of revelations that could shake the monarchy to its core? But the answer was still ahead, just beyond the palace doors, in a storm that was building quietly, yet irresistibly. And what came next would set in motion a series of events that nobody, not even the most seasoned royal observers, could have predicted. What if the most innocent person in a scandal was also the center of it? That was the paradox at the heart of Buckingham Palace now. Archie, a bright-eyed child with a smile that melted public hearts, had suddenly become the focal point of a storm he could not comprehend, a controversy he could not influence, and a revelation that threatened to rewrite everything about his family and his future. The palace staff, well-versed in centuries of protocol, whispered about Archie in ways that felt both surreal and terrifying. Every conversation was measured, every gesture observed. A child who had once been celebrated as the continuation of royal legacy was now quietly scrutinized as a potential complication. The word secret hung over him like a shadow. And unlike other palace scandals that played out in the tabloids, this one had a truth that only a few could see, and it carried consequences far beyond what anyone imagined. So what exactly was this secret? While no official statement would ever articulate it, insiders knew it was more than a rumor. It was about lineage, legitimacy, and privilege. It raised questions about who Archie truly was in the eyes of tradition. For a monarchy built on continuity and bloodlines, such a revelation was explosive. And King Charles, the steward of centuries-old expectations, understood the gravity immediately. This wasn't about gossip. This was about history, and the stakes were enormous. Imagine being Archie, if only for a moment, in this storm. A child too young to understand politics, duty, or legacy, yet suddenly bearing the weight of expectations and scrutiny meant for adults. Every smile he gave at public appearances, every wave to well-wishers, suddenly carried the invisible weight of speculation. Every move, every laugh, Every innocent gesture was now framed within a narrative of secrecy and controversy. It is almost unimaginable, yet it was the reality inside the palace walls. Harry and Meghan, though aware of tensions at the palace, had no idea that their child's very existence was under this kind of scrutiny. Their focus had been on providing him with love, stability, and a sense of identity. They wanted him to grow up with some semblance of normalcy despite the glaring public attention. But this was the royal world. Normalcy was fleeting, and innocence could not shield you from the forces of tradition and expectation. King Charles faced a dilemma that no monarch had faced in recent history. The revelation about Archie was delicate, personal, and politically charged. Any misstep could inflame public opinion, alienate allies, or spark an unprecedented crisis within the family. But inaction was not an option. The secret demanded acknowledgement. It demanded decisions. And those decisions, once made, could not be reversed without consequence. To understand the full weight of this revelation, one must consider the monarchy itself. A royal family is not just a family, it is an institution. Every title, privilege, and responsibility carries centuries of precedent. Removing or altering them is not merely a symbolic gesture. It signals authority, sets legal precedent, and sends a message to the world that the institution's rules are immutable. In this case, Archie, as a child, represented both continuity and risk, innocence and complication. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. There were meetings, closed-door discussions that stretched for hours. Advisors, lawyers, and confidants weighed the options, debated the consequences, and attempted to chart a course that would protect both the child and the monarchy. But how do you protect a child when the very fact of his existence, or how he is perceived within the institution, is now a potential point of conflict? The answer was elusive, frustrating, and emotionally charged. Harry, despite his rebellious streak and independence, would have been horrified to know that Archie's legitimacy, or perceived legitimacy, was even being questioned. Meghan, whose instincts for protecting her family were fierce, would have felt a mixture of fear, anger, and defiance. The palace, for all its history and power, suddenly faced a personal reckoning that cut to the very core of family bonds. Every advisor understood the stakes. Every conversation was laced with the tension of history pressing down. Even the security teams, usually focused on tangible threats, sensed the emotional charge in the palace. This was not about violence or espionage. It was about a family secret with the power to destabilize centuries of tradition. And everyone knew it. The question on everyone's mind was simple but terrifying. How would King Charles handle it? Would he act out of paternal concern, protecting his grandson and trying to shield him from public scrutiny? Or would he act decisively as a monarch, prioritizing the rules, traditions, and expectations of the crown over personal feelings? History had rarely offered guidance for such a situation, and the weight of precedent was almost meaningless in the face of raw emotion and unprecedented revelation. The palace atmosphere became a complex interplay of subtle strategies. Staff tiptoed around conversations. Security adjusted schedules and access points. Advisors prepared talking points and contingency plans. And the family members, each with their own perspectives, began to feel the tension in ways both explicit and invisible. Every moment was a negotiation between private life and public duty, between affection and obligation. Yet, even in this storm, there was the human element. King Charles, despite the authority he wielded, was still a father. Every decision carried the emotional weight of potentially hurting a child he loved. And Harry and Meghan, despite their public persona of independence, were still parents fighting to protect their child. The clash of roles, parent versus monarch, love versus duty, created a tension that few could navigate. Archie, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware. To him, life was playgrounds, storybooks, and family moments. He could not understand the significance of whispered conversations or the urgent tone in letters exchanged among adults. But the adults around him understood. A single revelation could alter his life forever. Every choice, every word, every gesture could ripple forward, shaping his identity, his privileges, and his place in history. And so, the palace entered a phase of strategic tension. Plans were drafted, conversations were rehearsed, and possible scenarios debated. Advisors proposed various courses of action, discreetly adjusting titles, issuing quiet statements, or, in extreme cases, revoking privileges entirely. Each option had its pros and cons, each carried legal and emotional ramifications, and each would inevitably leave a trail of consequences. It became clear that this was not merely about a child or a family. It was about perception, authority, and precedent. The monarchy's power depends on public confidence, on the perception that it operates with fairness, legitimacy, and continuity. A secret about Archie, if revealed publicly or even if managed poorly, could erode that perception. And King Charles, acutely aware of this, knew that every action he took had to reinforce, rather than undermine, the institution he had inherited. Yet, even with all the planning and consideration, uncertainty remained. How would Harry respond to potential actions? How would Meghan react? What would the public think? And most importantly, how would Archie's status within the family and the monarchy ultimately be defined? These questions loomed over the palace like a storm cloud ready to break. The tension reached its peak when a final meeting was held in a private room, far from the eyes of the public and the press. The king, surrounded by his closest advisors, weighed the facts, the implications, and the potential fallout. Every word was deliberate, every pause meaningful. The stakes could not have been higher. And in that moment, a decision began to crystallize, one that would change the course of the family, the child, and the monarchy itself. The revelation about Archie had become undeniable. It was no longer something to be managed quietly or hoped away. It demanded action. It demanded clarity. And it demanded decisions that would reverberate through the palace, through the family, and through the world. But what that action would be, and how it would be received, remained a question. The next step was imminent, the consequences unavoidable, and the storm, once merely a whisper in the palace corridors, was now fully upon them. And what came next would shock even the most seasoned observers, changing not only the perception of a child, but the trajectory of an entire family legacy. Betrayal doesn't arrive with fanfare. It creeps in quietly, almost imperceptibly, until suddenly the entire foundation beneath you begins to shake. That is precisely what Buckingham Palace felt as the revelation about Archie spread through the corridors of power. What had begun as a quiet unease escalated into something far more volatile, a collision of loyalty, expectation, and raw emotion. And at the center of it all were family ties, strained, fragile, and suddenly exposed for all their complexity. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must first recognize the palace as a crucible of emotion and tradition. Royal families are human, but they live under conditions few can imagine. Every decision carries historical weight. Every action is scrutinized, not only by the public, but by centuries of precedent. When trust fractures here, it fractures dramatically. And in this case, trust had been tested in ways that cut to the very heart of family bonds. King Charles, despite his years of experience and measured composure, felt the sting of personal betrayal. The revelation about Archie forced him to confront uncomfortable truths, not just about his grandson, but about the actions and decisions of his own children. Was this a lapse of judgment, a deliberate deception, or a consequence of choices made without consideration for the family's broader obligations? These questions gnawed at him, and while he understood the stakes for the monarchy, he could not ignore the personal betrayal that had accompanied the institutional challenge. Harry, for his part, was caught between rebellion and responsibility. He had long sought to carve out independence from the monarchy, to define his life outside of expectation and scrutiny. Yet the family's reaction to the revelation about Archie placed him squarely back within the web he had tried to escape. Every conversation, every glance, every subtle reprimand reminded him that blood ties carried obligations he could not simply discard. The tension between freedom and duty became unbearable, and the cracks within the family widened. Meghan, always protective of her son, was equally acutely aware of the stakes. For her, this was not merely a question of protocol or tradition. It was a question of safety, dignity, and the preservation of her family unit. She had navigated criticism from the public, media, and even elements within the palace before, but the personal nature of this revelation added a new layer of urgency and intensity. Her strategies, calm in public, were deliberate behind closed doors. Protect Archie, navigate the palace carefully, and maintain as much control as possible over a situation spiraling beyond her reach. And then there were the subtler dynamics, the undercurrents that had existed for years but were now exposed with unflinching clarity. Sibling rivalries, unspoken resentments, and long-standing differences of opinion suddenly erupted in ways that had been suppressed in the name of protocol. William, the elder brother, for example, had always positioned himself as the dutiful heir, committed to the crown and its expectations. Harry's choices, amplified by Meghan's influence, represented both a personal challenge and a public one, testing not only family loyalty but the boundaries of traditional roles. Conversations that once might have been private disagreements were now fraught with historical consequence. Every minor argument, every whispered critique, became amplified. The palace walls, which had witnessed centuries of drama, now felt almost alive with the tension of anticipation. Staff moved carefully, aware that even the smallest slip could trigger exposure or misinterpretation. In this environment, every actor had to navigate complex motives. Advisors sought to protect the institution while balancing the human cost of each decision. Security personnel monitored not just physical movements but subtle interactions. And the family members themselves were trapped between private sentiment and public duty. In this high-stakes environment, betrayal was never just personal, it was institutional. The revelation about Archie also exposed contradictions within the family. How could Harry claim independence while still demanding recognition and protection for his son? How could Meghan assert autonomy while still being bound by the unspoken rules of the monarchy? And how could King Charles act decisively without fracturing bonds that were already fragile? These contradictions created tension that was almost tangible, a pressure cooker ready to explode. Emotions ran high. Anger, frustration, and disappointment swirled alongside love, loyalty, and regret. Every meeting, every phone call, every interaction carried the weight of history and the burden of potential betrayal. Even the most rational members of the family struggled to reconcile personal feelings with institutional obligations. And as the palace braced for the coming decisions, these tensions were only magnified. Then came the first overt signs of betrayal. Not violent, not public, but subtle. Missed meetings, delayed responses, carefully worded statements that hinted at frustration and disapproval. These small acts signaled that family solidarity was fracturing. And while no one spoke openly about it, the message was clear: trust had been breached, and the consequences would be unavoidable. This sense of betrayal extended beyond words. Private communications, once expected to be confidential, were scrutinized for hidden meaning. Alliances formed and dissolved behind closed doors. The palace, normally a bastion of decorum and restraint, became a theater of tension where every gesture and glance carried unspoken weight. And through it all, Archie remained the focal point, the innocent at the center of a storm of adult politics and emotion. The stakes were immense. Every decision, every conversation, every action could affect public perception, familial bonds, and the integrity of the monarchy itself. It was a delicate balance. Act too harshly and risk alienating Harry and Meghan. Act too gently and risk undermining the institution. The tension was amplified by the knowledge that the public, though largely unaware of the full story, was watching closely, ready to interpret every fragment of information through the lens of speculation and scandal. And yet, in the midst of this tension, small moments of vulnerability emerged. King Charles, despite his authority, showed signs of personal anguish. Harry expressed frustration and helplessness. Meghan demonstrated both defiance and anxiety. Even staff, who had long been trained to maintain composure, were affected by the emotional intensity radiating through the palace. The human cost of this revelation was palpable. The culmination of these tensions was inevitable. Private meetings became longer and more charged. Advisors debated not only strategy but ethics, legality, and emotion. Security protocols were adjusted to account for new scenarios. And the family members, each navigating their own mix of love, anger, and fear, prepared themselves for the coming confrontation. Through it all, one question hung in the air. Could the family survive this breach of trust? Could loyalty withstand the revelation that had exposed contradictions, challenged authority, and put an innocent child at the center of a maelstrom? Or would the palace, for all its history, witness a fracture that could alter the monarchy forever? Every actor understood that the storm was no longer on the horizon. It had arrived. And as the palace braced, each decision became heavier, each conversation more critical, and each interaction a test of loyalty and character. But what came next would go beyond private tension and subtle betrayal. It would demand action, confrontation, and decisions that none of them could avoid. And when that moment arrived, the consequences would reverberate not just through the family, but across the world. What if everything you saw in public was only half the story? What if the smiles, the red carpet appearances, and the carefully crafted interviews were just a performance, concealing a storm raging behind closed doors? That is exactly the reality for Harry and Meghan. For them, the world sees glamour, charm, and confidence. But behind the scenes, life is far more complicated, fraught with tension, fear, and unrelenting pressure. To the public, Harry and Meghan appeared unstoppable. Every appearance, from charity galas to interviews, was polished, controlled, and seemingly effortless. Meghan's charisma and poise captivated audiences worldwide, while Harry's charm, humor, and occasional vulnerability made him relatable despite royal protocols. They were, on the surface, the perfect modern power couple, glamorous, influential, and unshakably united. But public persona and private reality rarely align. Every time they stepped into the spotlight, they were performing a delicate balancing act. On one side was the world, media scrutiny, public opinion, and an unrelenting global fascination with their every move. On the other side was the palace, unspoken rules, centuries of tradition, and expectations that could not be ignored. And in the middle was Archie, whose innocence and vulnerability amplified every decision they made. Their public statements often masked the emotional turmoil they were experiencing behind palace walls. Interviews carefully worded to convey independence, fairness, or composure often hid fear, frustration, and a sense of betrayal. Every phrase, every carefully measured comment, was both a statement to the world and a shield against private pressures that few could imagine. Meghan, particularly, mastered the art of maintaining composure under extreme scrutiny. She was aware that her words carried weight far beyond ordinary celebrity influence. Every smile, every gesture, every carefully phrased sentence was calculated to communicate strength, confidence, and control. But behind the cameras, the stakes were personal. She was protecting her child and her marriage while navigating a system built on centuries of expectations. Expectations that often conflicted with her values, her desires, and her understanding of fairness. Harry's public persona was similarly complex. He projected charm, confidence, and sometimes vulnerability, but privately, he was grappling with a storm of frustration and helplessness. His attempts to protect Archie, support Meghan, and maintain some measure of personal freedom were constrained by tradition, protocol, and the expectations of both the family and the public. Every public smile hid private anxiety, and every confident declaration masked a fear of what was to come. Even in moments of apparent joy, playful interactions with Archie, family celebrations, or public appearances meant to convey unity, the couple was acutely aware of the pressures pressing in from all directions. Cameras never stopped clicking, whispers never stopped circulating, and the palace never stopped watching. Every gesture was scrutinized for hidden meaning, every statement dissected for nuance. The weight of expectation was omnipresent. And yet, despite the public facade, the private reality was undeniable. Behind closed doors, conversations were tense, emotional, and fraught with strategy. Plans were debated in whispers. Every action was considered not only for its immediate impact, but for its long-term consequences. How would the palace react to their choices? How would the public perceive them? How could they protect Archie while also maintaining their own agency and dignity? These questions shaped every decision, every word, and every action. The dichotomy between public appearance and private reality became increasingly pronounced after the revelation about Archie. In public, Harry and Meghan continued to maintain appearances of composure and unity. Interviews were carefully scripted. Social media posts were curated. Public appearances were rehearsed. Every outward display reinforced an image of normalcy, strength, and confidence. Privately, however, the tension was unbearable. Every word in the palace, every message received, every subtle hint of criticism or judgment reminded them that the revelation about Archie was more than just a private matter. It was a crisis. It threatened to reshape their privileges, redefine their public narrative, and force them to confront challenges that few outside the palace walls could imagine. The contrast between appearance and reality was not just emotional, it was strategic. Maintaining the public facade was necessary. Every misstep in public could be exploited, misinterpreted, or amplified in ways that would exacerbate the private crisis. Harry and Meghan understood this implicitly. Their smiles were shields, their gestures carefully measured, and their words meticulously chosen to convey confidence and control, even when fear and frustration ran deep beneath the surface. The couple also had to navigate the perceptions of the wider world. Media outlets monitored every action, dissecting interviews and appearances for clues about internal palace dynamics. Social media amplified every rumor, every subtle gesture, and every headline. Public opinion shifted daily, often unpredictably, based on the smallest fragment of information. In this environment, maintaining a controlled public image was not optional, it was essential for survival. At the same time, Harry and Meghan were acutely aware that the palace was not static. Decisions about titles, privileges, and status could be imminent. Every interaction within the family carried weight. Every private conversation could influence outcomes. And every decision, no matter how minor, could affect Archie's future and their own ability to maintain autonomy within or outside the monarchy. The tension between public facade and private reality created a high-stakes environment where every choice mattered. Even seemingly trivial moments, a glance during a meeting, a subtle tone in a conversation, or a pause in a public address, carried layered meaning. Harry and Meghan were constantly negotiating these dual realities, striving to project stability and control while managing a deeply uncertain and emotionally charged private world. And yet, the pressure also exposed cracks in their relationships with others in the family. Private disagreements, differences in approach, and subtle tensions were magnified by the revelation about Archie. The palace, often viewed as monolithic and disciplined, was now a complex web of alliances, resentments, and unspoken strategies. Harry and Meghan found themselves navigating not only their own challenges, but the intricate dynamics of a family that had historically operated with careful precision. This duality, between public image and private reality, was a defining feature of their lives in this period. Every public smile was a calculated decision. Every appearance was a performance meant to protect personal dignity, manage public perception, and maintain a sense of normalcy for Archie. Behind the polished veneer, however, lay fear, anxiety, and the constant calculation of consequences. And as the tension reached a boiling point, the divide between public and private life grew more pronounced. Every carefully orchestrated interview, every smile at a charity event, every gesture captured by cameras contrasted sharply with the private turmoil inside the palace. The revelation about Archie was not merely a family secret. It was a catalyst that exposed the stark differences between what the world saw and what actually was happening behind closed doors. Yet even in this high-stakes environment, Harry and Meghan were not passive observers. They strategized, planned, and made calculated decisions to protect their family, maintain dignity, and assert some degree of control over events spiraling beyond their control. Their public facade was deliberate, but it was also a shield against the chaos threatening to engulf them. Every moment, every gesture, every word was an attempt to maintain balance between survival and authenticity, between image and reality. And as the storm around Archie's secret continued to unfold, the contrast between appearance and reality became a defining factor in the coming decisions. Harry and Meghan knew that sooner or later, the palace, the public, and the world at large would be forced to confront truths that could no longer be concealed. And when that moment arrived, the duality between what was seen and what was real would become stark, unavoidable, and potentially explosive. But what came next would force the couple, and the entire royal family, to face consequences that no amount of public composure could deflect. Decisions made in the private corridors of Buckingham Palace were about to collide with public reality in a way that would change everything. What does it feel like to carry the weight of centuries on your shoulders and realize that one revelation could shatter everything? That was King Charles's reality in the days following the disclosure about Archie. He had spent his entire life preparing to uphold the monarchy, balancing tradition with modernity, authority with compassion. But never had he faced a challenge so personal, so volatile, and so unprecedented. The palace had grown tense, charged with a mixture of anticipation, fear, and uncertainty. Every aide, every advisor, every family member understood that a decisive moment was approaching. And the decision at hand was far from simple. How could he act in a way that preserved the dignity of the monarchy, upheld centuries of tradition, and yet acknowledged the humanity of his own family? Meetings were convened in the most secure rooms of Buckingham Palace. Legal advisors, senior aides, and trusted confidants gathered to discuss options, anticipate consequences, and provide counsel. Every word spoken carried immense weight. Every strategy considered had layers of complexity, both legal and emotional. This was not just a matter of protocol. It was a test of judgment, wisdom, and leadership under extreme pressure. King Charles himself was deliberate. He read every document, considered every possibility, and weighed the implications of every potential action. Should he confront Harry and Meghan privately first? Should he issue a warning? Should he act decisively to revoke privileges, signaling to the public and the palace that rules and tradition remain paramount? Every option had profound consequences, and none were without risk. The breaking point came quietly, almost imperceptibly. One morning, after reviewing correspondence, legal opinions, and advisory memos, the king realized that indecision was no longer acceptable. The palace, the institution, and his family all depended on action. Delay would be interpreted as weakness. Hesitation would embolden speculation. And most importantly, the secret about Archie could no longer remain unresolved. The decision was both simple and devastating. Harry and Meghan's titles and privileges would be revoked. It was a decisive, irreversible act, grounded in centuries of precedent, yet laden with personal and emotional consequences. The decision reflected not anger, nor vindictiveness, but a commitment to duty, a choice made with an understanding of the immense responsibility resting on his shoulders. Delivering the news was another challenge entirely. King Charles faced the delicate task of balancing authority with compassion, of maintaining dignity while conveying consequences that would sting deeply. Meetings were scheduled with Harry and Meghan, private and confidential, where the weight of the monarchy would collide directly with the vulnerability of family. It was a confrontation none could escape, a moment of reckoning that would change relationships forever. When the meeting occurred, the tension in the room was palpable. Advisors lingered nearby, aware that their presence was both necessary and potentially intrusive. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with emotion and the gravity of history. Harry and Meghan, though prepared for confrontation, could hardly have anticipated the magnitude of what was to be conveyed. King Charles spoke with calm authority, yet his words carried the unmistakable weight of personal grief. He outlined the decision, the rationale, and the historical precedent supporting it. He explained that the revocation of titles and privileges was not a punishment born of anger, but a necessary action to protect the integrity of the monarchy and the continuity of its traditions. Every phrase was measured, precise, and unflinching. For Harry and Meghan, the news landed like a thunderclap. They had long known that tensions existed, but the revocation of titles was more than symbolic. It was a public declaration that their actions, and by extension their son's status, were no longer in alignment with the institution they had been born into or married into. The weight of history, duty, and expectation pressed down on them with an intensity that was almost suffocating. Emotions erupted quietly, not in shouting or confrontation, but in subtle gestures, strained tones, and restrained expressions of frustration, disbelief, and hurt. Harry felt anger, but also helplessness, as if the institution he had tried to reconcile with had turned decisively against him. Meghan, protective of Archie, expressed a mixture of defiance and deep concern for her son's well-being. The room, despite its decorum, was a crucible of emotion, where duty and love collided with unrelenting force. Outside the private chambers, the palace buzzed with anticipation. Staff sensed the tension, security was heightened subtly, and the advisors who had mediated the meeting were aware that history had just been made in a way few could fully comprehend. Every action, every word, every decision was now layered with the understanding that the consequences